Welcome back to another episode of the Critical Fools podcast. This is episode number 39, where we will be reviewing this week. It's a 2002 film, I believe. Yes, 2002, City of God. And so this is a Brazilian film made by, and I apologize, I do not speak Portuguese, so I'm going to try my best to say his name, but Fernando Meirelles. I don't know if you have a better way of pronouncing his last name. But anyway, aside from that, this is based on the 1997 novel of the same name, City of God. And I'm not going to try to say the original Portuguese title as well, because I know I'm going to butcher that. If it was in Spanish, I could say it, well, not Portuguese. And so this is interesting because it is based on some historical events from Brazil in the, I believe, 70s, 80s, and 90s, sort of talking about some rival drug wars that went on in the favelas of Rio, specifically the favela of City of God. And so, yeah, let's jump into it. I want to get your thoughts, Chris. What did you think about this film? What are your initial takeaways?
This film was it's my kind of movie. I really like this film. I'll say that off the bat. I think this film was also, I guess, for more a little historical context, I think this film made its debut in Cannes, 2002, yep. Right? Yeah. But yeah, I think this film, I think what I find fascinating about this film off the offset is like the story it tells you, right? And it's hard to do this in a movie, right? But like it tries to show you slices of different eras, you know, and like I said, in this favela in Brazil. And it starts with like, you know, a time when it was like new, you know, housing development, you know, mm-hmm. And like you see that like, you know, people are just, you know, trying to survive, grow with the economy. Like to give some bigger context here, like this is also a time where like the Brazilian demographics was like not what it is today, right? It was like a lot of young people, a lot of like a huge, at the time, probably many people believed a huge potential, right? And, you know, unfortunately, we've seen what's happened in the end. But so I thought that was fascinating from the offset. And yeah, and like how you see that, like, you know, these young men, you know, they go from street crime, which is, I think they were just stealing like gas in the beginning, to how it evolved to like organized, basically, you know,
organized gangs.
And organized gangs that move guns, drugs, and stuff. I thought that the whole like offset, like just that the intertwined story was well done, and obviously shown through the characters like Rocket and others. Mm-hmm. So I like I said, this movie was definitely, you know, I would say it's definitely a must watch for like most people, especially for people who just don't know enough about this world in general. But also like you're realizing that like Brazil, it's almost a sad movie because even though it came out in 2002, but now we have the hindsight of 2021, that like there was a time where there was a lot of optimism in Brazil and a lot of like, you know, potential of what the country could be. And unfortunately you could now like probably argue that like it's been a lot of unfulfilled potential.
Mm-hmm. No, so I agree.
What were your thoughts? Yeah, go ahead.
I just thought this was interesting because we've both seen quite a few films from like the early 2000s, and this sort of follows. I don't know exactly if this was the first film to do so, but I like the sort of style where the opening scene ends up being one of the final scenes at the end of the movie, and so that's interesting because you've seen a lot of subsequent films sort of go with this style of filmmaking where they'll start from the end and then in the beginning, and then sort of tie it all back together right through the story. And you see at the end, it's like, oh, well, this is where the scene comes from. So I imagine this is one of the first films to do so. I know like in 2000 when Amores Perros came out, that was the first movie, or one of the first movies, I can't say if it was exactly the first, to essentially tie three different story arcs together by one event. You also had films like Memento that started, it was more like sort of an experimental time in the early 2000s where you're trying to storytell in different, more creative ways, right? Because with Memento, I don't know if you've seen the film, but you sort of have two different stories that are being told simultaneously, and then they end up sort of converging, which is sort of interesting, and I kind of always appreciate these sort of styles of filmmaking. But I thought it was very good. I thought there was, it was interesting seeing the historical progression of Rio and what they were trying to convey. And I thought that flow of the movie was very good. Like I was never bored. It was a little over 2 hours, and it was pretty action packed, but in a continuous way, which always like I felt like I was engaged throughout the whole film.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I thought the pace was great. Like I felt like I never felt like a dull moment, or I felt like I thought even the slow moments were good. Like, yeah, I think the pace was great. Yeah, continue.
What did you think of the main characters, that being Rocket, Lil Z, and Benny?
Yeah, I mean, it's yeah, I mean, all of them we can talk about for a while,
Sure.
but I think so. Obviously, like with so going back to the beginning of the film, right? Like Rocket and his brother, right? Like you see that, like again, like I think Rocket's brother represents like a different time, like in Brazil, like in the sense that like these are young men who, it's kind of like, how do I describe it? Like they didn't have like the prospects to move up, but they didn't like, as much as I don't like Little Z's character, they didn't see like, I guess they weren't like big picture enough. Like Little Z, like as much as he's problematic in the movie, he did see big picture, and even though he was kind of psychotic at times, and like Rocket's older brother, which I forgot his name, but he I think his name was Goose, but like these guys were just like stealing here and there from trucks. They were chasing the girls. It's kind of like that naivete of youth, right? Like you're a young adult, like young teenager / young adult, while like and this is obvious spoiler podcast, but obviously he will end up getting killed himself like the others. And well, actually, no, one I think becomes like a priest. One Goose dies. I forgot what happens to the other guy, but you see that like they just didn't, they were kind of like doing what we often off camera we talk about. Like they were just kind of fumbling through life, like, oh, whatever comes next is what I'll do. But yeah, I think Rocket, at least I think by luck, right? Because at least in the movie, it's portrayed that like he just had this passion for photography, and this is what ends up making him stay straight, actually. And I mean, that gets to a bigger point about like how like sometimes you just need like a passion, a path for you, so you don't like become tempted by the world of like vice and quick money and stuff like that, which is the world that Little Z is like huge in, and obviously Benny as well, right? Like Benny's in that world, which we'll get to Benny because his character is the one that's like
it's different.
Yeah, different, and he has different dreams at one point. But unfortunately, we'll get there. But like unfortunately, his story takes a turn for the worse. But yeah, I guess something I wanted to ask you about actually is like, what did you think of like? So obviously in this movie, there's obviously the societal and there's the storyline. But one thing I did find interesting was like Rocket's like relationship with that chick. What's her name?
It's the one that ends up dating Benny.
Yeah. I was curious about like, okay, go ahead. Like I forgot her name, but I was curious about what you thought about like I just when I like that was one of the subplots where I was just like, this is like the typical. Maybe it's also the time period I'm in where I'm dealing with a lot of this kind of stuff right now. Angelica, yeah. Like I'm dealing maybe a lot more of these kind of conversations. Maybe that's just the timing too. Because I watched this and I was just like, my goodness, like, is this movie trying to tell me another thing too? Like, is this Destiny? Like,
no, I mean,
it's Well, my whole point is that like, what would you think of that relation, like that whole dynamic? Like, it's a subplot in the movie, but like, what did you think of like his, the way he was like thinking about like a girl and chasing?
That's more minor. I mean, well, they're kids at this point, so this is his first real like love interest, right? And you can tell like you can tell that Rocket is just like he doesn't have a lot of experience talking to like women or chicks. Like it's often like he always reemphasizes and it keeps being brought up that he's a virgin, right? And so like because of that, like it affects him in quite a way. I mean, it's not really, I guess it's personal to Rocket, but it doesn't really add anything to the actual like story arc, if that makes sense. Other than Benny like tries to quit the game because of her.
Yeah, but so that's why I mean like it's isolated enough where I felt like it was. I question what the purpose of that subplot was. Maybe it was to humanize Rocket, but I also thought that like.
It also helped like show the divide in interest between Benny and Lil Z.
Yeah,
like, she was sort of the catalyst for that too.
But I think also it speaks to maybe a universal I'm gonna say at least straight guy thing, where like I just found it interesting how like he was doing all the typical things that like
I
a
don't even
certain
know. I don't know if it has to do anything with hetero, right? I mean, most people, unless you're asexual, right? Most people go through life and eventually you find your sort of like your first love interest.
Yeah, I wanted to finish my point where basically what I'm saying is that this is also what's maybe changed since like 2002 is that now there's a lot of let's say intellect. Well, I'm not gonna say intellectual. There's a lot of opinions around like, oh, because one thing that I noticed that he was just trying to, like you said, be in her orbit, right? Like get her the marijuana, hang out with her,
Yeah, he
basically
was
like,
trying to be the overly nice dude.
yeah, and be in her like orbit, as they say. And I'm thinking of now all this modern literature that I come across now that's like, you shouldn't do that. She should come begging to you. Like, I just, in my mind, I was just like, maybe how things have changed in 20 years,
She should
because
come begging. Yeah, I don't know if that's the dominating narrative.
I wouldn't say for people who are like normal and like that just follow their instincts, but I think for, let's say, a certain segment of the internet that's growing ever more. But I just thought that subplot was interesting. But it's I wanted to bring up that I didn't see. I was gonna ask. I guess you answered it. Is like, did you see any value in that subplot? Because other than the anything, I didn't see much. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think it was more a storyline to try to help the progression to show that Benny sort of changed his wants and desires, right? Because he talked about going and basically starting some farm in the middle of nowhere, just them two. And she like really tries to tell him, like, you need to leave. We should go get away from all the violence, start a better life, kind of deal. That's pretty much what her character was meant for.
Yeah, and one character we haven't mentioned. There's actually two other characters I think are important to this film, which is Carrot and
right.
Who was the guy he hires?
Manny. Chicken Manny.
Yeah.
The knockout Ned.
Knockout Ned. Yeah, so I mean, there's other characters too that tie, but those are two are I think also important. We'll get to them, but yeah, I guess if we're starting for like because I feel like this movie it flows one way and then spoiler Benny dies and then like it goes like a different it's like an act 2, right? With Benny, going back to Benny, it was like he was kind of like this happens in like any like team dynamic or corporation, right? Or gang in this case, right? Like he was kind of like the buffer between little Z's like darker instincts. And we see this with the children, the runts that when he has to deal with them. And obviously like the wider world which is more nuanced sometimes and more like you gotta like, play the long game, as they say, right? Play the, because in little Z's mind, like it's just like, my way or the highway, right? But
it's interesting. The one thing I will say about Lil Z, right? He kind of reminded me of, because we both seen the show. He reminded me a lot of like Marlo from The Wire, right? In terms of his sort of ruthless ambition, always wanted to expand and sort of taking no prisoners. But at the same time, he kind of did have some like code of ethics in a way, in that he tried to tell Carrot basically not to use the little kids to like thieve. He wanted to protect parts of like the barrio, essentially. So it was interesting because as ruthless as he was, did have some like code, and so that's why he wasn't completely amoral, I would say. As like very ruthless and violent as he was, it was interesting that he had a couple rules.
Yeah, which
I don't know if you agree with that.
Yeah, because one thing there was because my counterpoints would be, well, in the beginning of the film, he ruthlessly kills all those people in the hotel, right?
Right.
And then also when he, but also when he tells, I forgot what character is. He tells one of them to like prove that you're a man, like you got to kill one of these like runts after they cross him. Right?
The runts, that's what they're on. Yeah.
So yeah, I would say that like maybe when he thought these were like just kids, but
he did that because they were stealing and taking advantage of all the local shops, right? And he says basically no one does that in my area and like doesn't face any consequences.
Yeah, I'm just saying that his moral compass, I feel like, is very.
Oh, it's messed up. I will give you that.
It's still self-serving. It's not really like set principles. That's what I'm saying. I don't think they're set principles. I just think it's like whatever floats his boat for that circumstance and what.
Kind of. Well, he said basically he wants them. Yeah, I would agree with that in that he wants everyone to know who really runs things and not to intimidate anyone without his say so.
Because my other counter argument is that later, when he gets obsessed with the media, it seems like his morals. I would say this is a perfect sentence. His morals are very narcissistic,
Oh
right? Because
yeah,
he gets obsessed with like the pictures and the press, and actually that's how Rocket gets into his
all
good
the
graces.
yeah.
We're jumping around a little bit, but like my whole like I'm just my counterpoints for like I think I don't like his rules to me never made sense, and they seem like they all just like they just served him like really like he didn't mind changing his own rules if it just served his own purpose. So
Yeah.
very Nietzschean in that way. So
Yeah, no, I agree with that. He was interesting. He did in many ways remind me of Marlowe though from The Wire.
yes, in
Just
terms of like
absolute ruthlessness.
ruthlessness, yes, I do agree there. He was definitely ruthless. He definitely, yeah. I mean, I remember that scene where they're outside the door of the character. Was it Knockout Ned? Like he ran to like the his parents' home or something like that, and like they're
He
just
was
outside.
ruthless. They ended up he sexually assaulted Knockout Ned's woman as well, which is sort of like another tipping point. Are you there?
Yeah, you lagged a bit. Continue.
Oh, so what I was saying is that one of the other big moments in the film was he takes advantage of Knockout Ned's girlfriend, right? And there's nothing that Knockout Ned could do, which ends up being like the catalyst. Um, and so they like come back and he kills the younger brother of Knockout Ned as well. So they had some very brutal moments in this film, and then that creates the huge drug war because he ends up going to Carrot, and they both end up fighting one another. Oh, because it must be said that Knockout Ned was a former it's basically a superstar military man.
Yeah. Yeah, he was in the military. Yeah.
But the other thing that I was interesting, and I should bring up, is interesting seeing the shift in how easily corrupted Knockout Ned became. He went from someone with huge morals to then he ended up robbing banks to fund themselves.
Yeah, I think this is something that I mean, we can. I think we watch a decent amount of these shows, so I think you can cross reference it with The Wire or Top Boy, where in this world, the morality is it's hard to judge. It's like we can judge from the outside, but I think when I think this is what the City of God does pretty well in this film. Once you're on the inside, you kind of normalize this world a little bit, right?
Behavior and what you have to do to survive.
Children with guns, taking the money, doing the drugs, selling it. And the only thing really that's separating them from just going all genocidal is the fact that the incentive structure is still they just want to get rich and get laid and and stuff like that. If these guys were psychos, let's just say the true serial killer types, these guys would just start skinning humans alive,
Mm-hmm.
Because everything is so degraded. There's no boundaries anymore, right? You see kids shooting and then they get killed and then that's one of the themes of this movie, but also those shows too, where
everything just becomes normalized.
Yeah, the Knockout Ned, he ends up getting killed by somebody who he killed, the kid of somebody who he killed, right? He was just waiting for his moment, right? And it speaks to again, but back to the beginning of the film where when Little Z is a kid, right? He's also even though it wasn't exactly the same, but a lot of these characters, and you see at the end too with the runs, right? Now they want to be the new kings. It's a perpetual cycle of, the only way we're gonna get rich and have pleasures of life is by becoming the kings of this world, because there's money to be made, as we all know. So I thought again this is something that's in a lot of these type of shows or films of the cyclical nature of the gang and drug wars. But also I did like the angle with the police. I thought that was interesting too, how the police are
the corruption.
Yeah.
I mean, it's just not surprising, right? And unfortunately, it was interesting in the context of this film because this film came out in 2002, right? And I can't remember exactly when Lula came into office, but it was more or less in the early 2000s, and there was a lot of promise for Brazil in terms of on the global sphere, right? Economically speaking, a lot of people were calling them one of the rising economies and countries. And then you see a lot of it was kind of just like a mirage, right? In 2014, and I know you've been watching a Netflix series based on this scandal, but they came out with a big corruption scandal It's called Lava Chateau, where they found that Albrecht, I believe is the company name from Brazil, that they were bribing officials all throughout Brazil and all throughout Latin America, and a lot of different politicians were found to be bribed. So it was interesting that this film shows like corruption sort of at the small level, but it sort of has permeated throughout all levels of the Brazilian government. And that came out years after the film.
Yeah, I mean, it's yeah, I don't have nothing really to add on. I just think that like in a film, right, where you're trying to, why I give this film credit is that like in these kind of films, even if it's 2 hours, especially with these kind of topics, you know, it's multifaceted, right? So you're trying to tell like an overall story, but then maybe little subplots too. And I think like the press, and I want to get into that too, but the police aspect was something that like even those small scenes where the cop is pretty much like, you know, where's my cut, you know, and like, oh, today, like I remember at the end too, where he's like, you know, today you're for the press carrot, basically, like you're not dying, but little Z, well, you know, he's been deemed expendable, basically.
Yeah, it was interesting, right? Oh, and then they had that I forgot what happens with the sequence, but yeah, the arms dealer gets robbed by Lil Z, and then he goes back and he's like, he's like, you take my guns, my supplier's gonna get pissed, and he's gonna come after you. Which they end up doing with that big showdown at the end, right? The police officer who ends up being like the arms dealer kills the sort of point of the middleman, and then rallies all the troops to try to show down with Lil Z because he jacked all of his arms.
Yeah.
So that it was an interesting plot. What did you? I was gonna ask. Or do you have any other questions or points you want to bring up?
Yeah, I was gonna go back a bit and what did you think of like so let's go back to when Benny is dreaming of a different life, and he gets accidentally killed by I think it's Blackie, right? His character was intriguing in the that part of the film. I'm curious, like, what you think of what do you think that character represented, and obviously we know how it ended for him. He didn't end well, but
yeah, I think more what I was trying to show with his character, it's like once you're in that life, it's very hard to leave that life, right? As powerful, and everyone like talks about how much they loved Benny, right? He was very beloved within the hood there because he was just funny. He was kind of like that everyman's kind of dude. And yeah, that character that killed him, he panics because he doesn't mean to shoot him. He meant to shoot Lil Z, right? But he ends up killing Benny, and Benny's murder ends up being killed by Carrot because Carrot realizes, well, shoot, man, you killed Benny, and he's the only reason why we're basically not at war with Lil Z, right? Because Lil Z was always trying to take his turf. And so it was interesting seeing Benny because you see the shift. He like grew up with Lil Z. They were homies. Lil Z didn't want him to leave this life. He was basically saying, screw the girl. Like, come stay this. Well, I'll give you like whatever you want, right? Because we're homies, man, and we're basically like bad boys for life. But Benny is like, nah, dude. He's like, this is my chick. I'm done with this life. We just want to like chill and leave it. And you see this often happens, man. You try to leave that life of selling, and it ends badly, and it does. Benny ends up dying, and that becomes a catalyst for a lot of the violent events after.
Yeah, one other like little, and this is where I give again credit to the film, where you kind of show don't tell. I also thought that Little Z was a little bit jealous of Benny because like Benny had the girl, and like he tried to do a dance with the girl.
He had the charm.
It didn't work out, and so he pulled out his gun because in Little Z's head, the only thing that he knows, one thing that works for him is power.
Is intimidation and violence.
Yeah.
Oh, and that's the first time you see Knockout Ned, and he humiliates Knockout Ned.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so I think I'm trying to remember. I think the first time you're introduced to Knockout Ned is when they take the bus. They talk about robbing the bus. It was Rocket and his buddy, and they end up saying, "No, we're not going to do that," right? And Knockout Ned kind of gives them advice that you should. What did he say? It's something like stay in school or something like that. You know, try to be like the good role model there. But it's interesting because you see that at that point he's just so moral and is just trying to be like a good sort of citizen within society, sort of following the rules, right? He's former military. And then at the end you see him and he's just like, it's just so consumed with revenge.
Yeah.
For all that Lil Z has taken from him. Where he ends up hurting a lot of the people that he said, that he basically was like in support of.
Yeah. Yeah. And even though I said earlier in this podcast that like the Angelica and Rocket, like it didn't like add to the storyline. I think what the director / screenwriters are trying to portray is that, and this is something that's throughout the film, right? Through Benny, through Little Z's interaction at the party where he gets rejected, through Knockout Ted and his girlfriend. Knockout Ned getting humiliated, and also later when Rocket has that experience with the journalist, is that like, and this is why again tip my hat to the film. I think they try to show us that like at least in this time period in Brazil, masculinity is tied to not just like bravado but also the ability to seduce women. Because there's too many instances in this movie. And I thought about after I watched it, like, okay, I got the main plot, but there's little cultural things that they add in the film that I think like you'd have to marinate on it a little bit and be like, oh, okay, like I see what they're kind of getting at here. There's too many instances of either the talk of pursuit of women or dating women or, being in bed with them. And like, it's very, I think what they're trying to show, my opinion is that they're trying to show that like, at least in this macho culture, like it's part of the projection you need to have, right? And I think they're also taking a critique perhaps like just like with like you said the power and the violence that is this always healthy because it's leading to certain dynamics of pettiness and rivalry. But yeah, I think this film, there's a lot of facets to it that I find very intriguing. So, as a follow up, I would say, like, what did you think of on this last thing on this topic? I guess is what did you think about Rocket's one night stand with the journalist? I thought was like, wow, like that's.
It was just weird. It didn't really add anything to the film. It almost felt kind of like predatory, which is I don't know. I don't really know a lot of normalcies within Brazilian culture, I guess, in society. So I don't know if that was, I guess, a more normal dynamic or not, but it was just, I found it odd being, I guess, an American. Like, it was just weird. And I don't know, like, you're not really told ages, but I don't know if he was below 18, which made it seem very weird. She was clearly much older than he was.
Yeah, she clearly looked like 33 or something.
At least. Like, it was interesting. I mean, that didn't really add to anything in the film, that interaction.
Yeah, I think again, I that's why I had to marinate on it. Is that like he ends up bragging about this? Like he says, like, "I don't tell," but
I guess
he makes a joke, and I think again it goes back to like they sprinkle it in. I think that theme of like the machismo being tied to the ability to I don't want to use any other lingo, but ability to seduce women. I'm gonna just say that. But instead of like the other talk I have, but yeah, so I think that was the last point I wanted to make on that. I just found that intriguing because like they sprinkle it in a bunch of times, in the subplots.
Mm-hmm.
But I agree with you. It looked predatory to a degree.
Yeah, it was. I don't know. That I was like, there's aspects where it was like, okay, like I kind of get why it was included, but I was like, there's something in scenes where it was just kind of like, if they didn't include it, it wouldn't have necessarily taken away from the film. I felt like that was one of them.
And that's why I had to think about it because I feel like with this kind of movie, I think they don't want to just tell us about the gang and drug culture. I think they also want us to have some other tidbits about society in this period and maybe still to this day, So moving on from that topic, what did you think of the press and the role they had in this film?
So I guess that's kind of interesting. I think the press, right, because this came out almost 20 years ago, and this is speaking on a time where it was like 20 or 30 years before then, right? Or I'm sorry, probably around 20 years before then. But it was just interesting seeing the influence that print media had back then. I'm like, man, it's just a completely different era than how things currently work in today's day and age. It's been about 40 years since the 80s, which is generally around more or less the time period when this film took place. And so, yeah, at that point, everyone read the paper. Everyone was very influenced. So seeing images, right, it helps to drive home the point, which is why they really wanted to get the pictures of Lil Z and some of the gangs to show what's really going on. Whereas today, I would say print media doesn't have the same effect because everyone's just blowing up and popping off on Twitter. Most people don't use traditional sort of even news media. You have all these different diversified sources, right? Whereas at that point, it was you had the main paper in Rio, whichever that was, and that was it. And that's where everyone got their source. There was no internet, nothing like that. So media had a huge impact, and that's really how you sort of got your fame and notoriety, which is what Lil Z wanted. He wanted his like image to be revered and almost immortalized, which is why he was so obsessed with having his picture taken by the press.
Yeah.
I don't know if you had anything else that you specifically wanted me to touch upon with the media.
No, I mean that was a good take. I wasn't thinking in terms of like the difference in time and how print media was. I guess what I was getting, like I was nudging towards is that one thing I found interesting was how you can tell, like again credit to the movie where they show and don't tell, where like the people, the journalists, right, they probably were educated and probably have access to access to life that Rocket didn't, because there's that scene where Rocket's like,
100.
"Are you kidding me?" Like he thought he didn't realize that Little Z wanted the pictures at the time, so he thought like he was gonna get killed if he came back, right?
Some of the normalcy.
Yeah. And he was just like, what? Like, you're asking me to risk my, like, I don't want to die for this.
So we know there's a huge level of inequality within Brazil. That's clearly, I mean, you could tell by the way favelas were set up, right? There were sort of the slums that former people who were enslaved set up on the outskirts of main cities in Brazil. That's more like, I'm simplifying, but that's some of the history of how they sort of spread out. So they became essentially like shanty towns. And because of that, like most of the people who worked in the press, right, they come from the more middle class to upper class levels of society within Rio or other parts of Brazil. And so because of that, they don't quite understand a lot of the nuances and the do's and don'ts of, some of the favela culture. And so like one of the things, like he's right, Lil Z's freaking out because he took pictures of them and they were meant to be his own pictures because Lil Z asked him to like bring them back to them. And they end up going to print and he's like, "Are you kidding me?" He's like, "You do this." And he's like, "And I'm dead." He's like, "That's just part of how things work. You don't go against the words or the wants of, someone who's a top dog in my hood." He's like, "That's just not the way things work in the city of God." He's like, "I don't know how things work down here in your like middle class neighborhoods." And so they're just like, they just can't comprehend that cultural difference, right? Because they don't come from that world. So it was interesting seeing those interactions, and that's the first time at least at the pace at his workplace where you see Rocket sort of stand up for himself, right? And so people kind of take notice a little bit. And the famous photographer, or like really sort of had his back, the guy who sort of really inspired Rocket. But yeah, it was definitely interesting because they asked, they're like, "Oh, like how did you get these photos?" And he's like, "Well, I live in the area." And they're like, "This is amazing. Like we can never penetrate like these neighborhoods." They're like, "Could you like go get more photos and do all this?" And he's like, "I'm taking a huge risk here, man." And he's like, "You don't know how things work." He's like, "Don't worry about it." And he's like, "Well," and that sort of leads to the segue. He's like, "I can't go back to my hood right now." And he's like, "I have no place to stay." And that's when the journalist who used his pictures without permission, invites her to like just crash at invites him to crash at her place.
And
so
makes him a lucky man. But
anyway,
you had an interesting take with the technology, like the difference in technology. For me, it was like that was one of the scenes that I feel was used to show like the divide between growing up in the favela and these people who don't understand that world.
Oh, it was a stark difference, dude. It's like growing up in a gated community, whereas
and credit to the scene, you see it on their facial expressions more than the words. They're like, "What?" Like he's really scared. Like he's like, "Man, you don't understand. Like
that's not the way things work, bro."
Yeah, you mess with Little Z, you end up capped. Like that's as fast.
Oh
as
yeah,
that.
you end up becoming a corpse.
Yeah, and he just again how like I said, the film is architected like it ends up working out right for Rocket that like
Yeah,
Lil Z
because
wanted
Lil
to-
Z just, unbeknownst to him, he just wanted to be revered. He wanted his image all over
Yeah.
the place,
yeah,
immortalized.
because there's an earlier scene where he's pissed that like Knockout Ned is like getting a TV interview. Remember?
Yeah, right. And he was just
Beca-
pissed.
be-
Why is he getting all the credit? This like
because
nobody.
because he's seen as a vigilante at the time.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah.
And he's just like, what the heck? This guy's a murderer, right? Little Z had a point, but it's like you're a murderer too, Little Z.
Oh yeah.
But
No,
yeah,
it was interesting. Yeah, and that's sort of the idea. It's like, dude, do you not see the irony, the hypocrisy, really, within what you're saying? But he
Yeah.
doesn't, right? Because Lil Z is just completely and utterly self-absorbed.
yeah, that's the truth. But yeah, so I thought even though they weren't like a major part of the film, most of the film is Rocket and like his journey. But when the press are in there, that's like obviously there's a I don't want to say critique, but how they're tied in, like how the press works, but also like the difference between like how, like you said, they're able to. They don't have like the fact that they said that line where like, how do you get like this picture? We can't even, we never even seen Little Z's face. Is because it shows you that they never go to the.
No, it's kind of like, in many ways, it kind of reminded me of, God, what's the movie? You've seen Training Day, right? It's kind of like when Denzel takes him to the jungle, right? And he's like, yo, and he's like, and basically the rookie in the movie's like, yo, like, what are we doing here? We're not supposed to be here. He's like, yeah. He's like, oh, you've heard about this place. They say never coming out of here without an army platoon. It's kind of like that idea. It's like there's certain worlds that you just can't venture into if you're not part of that world.
Yeah.
And that's definitely like how these people viewed the neighborhood of the city of God.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, it was that's why I wanted to just raise, because I thought those scenes were, again, like this movie is telling us a story, but also telling us a lot of subplots around a society, a time period in Brazil. So that's why I like again.
One other thing that I must note and give a lot of credit to the film, because it really adds to the experience and sort of drives home the cultural difference, is the musical score of the film. I really liked a lot of the samba, the traditional sounds, because it really gave you a feel and gave the movie sort of a life of its own, right? And it's completely different than any other movie that would be made in the U.S., because Brazil has a very different culture than the United States or any other country, really. I was curious, what did you think about the musical score?
No, the music was great, dude. I love the music.
Especially the opening scene, right?
Yeah,
I thought the opening
music.
scene was great. We didn't really touch upon this other than it comes back at the end. But even the little scene of the chicken moving and you hear the drums, the rhythm, it really starts to get you immersed within the film. I think that's not something that we really touched upon.
Yeah, we haven't touched upon the music yet. I thought the music was great. I thought like it was also well placed depending on the
throughout different scenes.
Different scenes. And like I said, like the Brazilian style, it gets your blood moving a little bit.
Yeah, a little bit of samba. Yeah. There's just something about the bongos, the rhythm.
Yeah,
I don't know.
Like, I mean, the music is like part of the film, but like this film like tips its hat a bit too, because even like the one scene in the beginning is like they're playing soccer.
So that was one thing.
They're playing soccer in the sand, which is a well-known stereotype of like how Brazilian players start, right? So like this film had like a bit of, they tipped out to almost every little bit of culture they could to.
The one thing I did like about the opening scene, it was a lot of quick move. It's rapid, which is kind of like helped you get going with the pace of the film, right? It was a lot of like the knife sharpening, cutting, like really quick cuts, which I actually really enjoyed and sort of got you into the mood, like what's going on. It's like getting you ready for this fast-paced world where it's very cutthroat. Yeah. I thought they did a good job with that opening scene.
Something I did cross my mind after I watched the film was that like not many Americans watch Brazilian films, so I wonder if like they felt a bit of a like pressure like as creators to show like as much as they could of like different aspects of Brazil,
Brazilian life and culture. Yeah, I'm sure they did. I just got to give credit. I thought they did a great job. It was one of the. I don't know if I've seen another Brazilian film. I thought this is very good. Obviously, it was on a lot of different film critics' top 10 lists for 2002, and I could see why. It was a very good film.
Yeah, it was good. Like, it's very...
It was unique. I'm sure I give it the time.
It's unique. It's also a film that I think... this is like 20 years after, it has aged
Mhm.
well. Like the style has aged well is what I mean. Because I've seen some older movies and it's like it's tough at times. But this movie is like I said, it's very watchable. And I think obviously you can't learn everything about Brazil in this film, but I think it tips its, that's, I like that term. It tips its hat enough where you're like, they're doing it right versus just like, oh, we're going to just project stereotypes. And also how they do it, right? They don't just say it or like show you like the Jesus statue. Like they tip their hat to different aspects of the society and culture of a certain, especially of a certain socioeconomic group.
Mhm. Yeah, it was interesting. I apparently, and I was just reading this quote because I was kind of curious as to like if the director had any follow up. And I can kind of see it. Apparently, they used a lot of amateur actors from Brazil who like lived in some of these same neighborhoods and areas. And part of the reason was he just wanted that authenticity to use some of these amateur actors. And I guess before, like a year or two leading up to the film's like actual filming process, they actually called a bunch of these children and young adults there to try to develop them into like minor actor workshops. And so I thought that was cool, and it really did add to the film because this film did feel very authentic, and you could see it based on the people they chose to fill out some of the more minor roles.
Yeah, that makes sense. Like I think I try to look up some of these actors after the fact, and they're not career actors. It reminds me of what happened with the Florida Project, right? Like he picked one person to be like a
One or
big,
two, right?
but everybody else was like they were part time or if not like hobbyists. And
Or just people who are around who happen to be a part of it.
yeah, and really it wasn't. It was at least for that Florida project because I remember listening to the interview. It was less about they didn't like look like like Floridian, but it was like he wanted them to look as much as like people that you would see in the street, like
Yeah,
versus like let's be honest, some actors now they get the training, they get like they have a different lifestyle. They might not
yeah.
like they might look human, but they might like they might have the best facial specialists that they see every week.
All right. No, I agree with that.
So to your point about authenticity, like directors are very aware that sometimes actors at certain points of their career do not come across as authentic anymore.
Yeah, and I think especially given that this was a film highlighting a specific time period within a specific neighborhood of Brazil, right? I think that was really a point that because at times they kind of made it want to feel like it was almost like a mini documentary, like a slightly fiction,
Right?
slightly fictionalized documentary. It's kind of like
Yeah,
how the vibe that I think they were going for. So
yeah,
authenticity was definitely very important.
because they cut across multiple decades in this film. So
Yeah, it was a lot where like the original shots in the 60s very different from how the late 80s to early 90s looked.
yeah,
Right, and you can see that it was really cool, and I do agree with you seeing the progression of how the neighborhood changed within those several decades. I thought they
yeah,
did a good job with it.
I agree. Yeah, this film is definitely a must watch for especially people who like just don't know much about Brazil. I think it's a good entryway to being a little more curious and going further down the rabbit hole.
Yeah, no, I agree. That was an enjoyable watch. I mean, this is the first Brazilian film we've reviewed.
Yeah.
I thought it was a good choice. Like it surprised me because I wasn't sure exactly what to expect from this film. I just I was the one who selected it, and I previously had seen, there was a lot of praise for this movie, and I can kind of see why, especially given the time at which this film came out. The style of this film has kind of been replicated by like a lot of other films, probably not in the same degree, but sort of the style of using, like I said at the beginning, the opening scene to be tied in, or the opening scene being the ending scene and tying it back in throughout the story.
Yeah, to your point, like I've heard of this film for many years. I just never got a chance to watch it until we decided to do an episode on it. And I see why there was a lot of hype in the time, and I still see why it's still like beloved. I will say that like I've seen some people say it's like top 3 movies ever. I think that's a bit.
Ooh, I think that might be stretching it. I would say it's a good watch though.
Yeah, it's. I think it's one of those films where I think it's because maybe it was so.
I think it was like revolutionary at the time.
Yeah. I think that's why it has a little bit more extra hype than it maybe should now. But I will say that this film is. I can see why it's still very beloved and why it's still a really good film and a top tier film. I have a hard time critiquing much about the film at all. Actually, I think to me,
I thought the ending was interesting and brutal. which we didn't really talk about in the film.
We will get there,
Yeah,
but I think in terms of like style and like the flow is great. Yeah, the ending, but the ending is also something that we see across with other shows, right? Like it's like the cycle continues. Yeah.
cyclical, right? But it's interesting because you just see Lil Z. He's just like he gets out right because he pays off the cops, but at the in the end, right? He's just like, yo, we need to go hustle. We need to make more. He's like, all right, where's the money? He's like, I don't have any money. And the kids were like, why the heck are we going to follow you then if you're not going to pay us? And that's when they decide to brutally kill Lil Z.
Yeah.
And then it leads to more chaos, which is, I think, what they were trying to show is just this chaotic cycle just continues. It's really hard to break, especially when your institutions are failing.
Yeah, and also that last scene, like even though the Runs kill Little Z, they want to be him, right? So that's always the paranoia being in this game, right? Like you want to be top, and to use that other show that I watched, Top Boy, you want to be the top guy, you know? You don't want to be a second fiddle.
I mean, yeah, at the end, it kind of starts like how Lil Z began, right? Lil Z dies at the end, and then the Runs kill him, and then they're like, yo, all right, we need to run this game. Basically, they're the next generation, and so they make like that hit list to take out all the other dealers. It's like, oh, okay, well, yeah, that was sort of the point of like the cycle just never ends.
Yeah, because Little Z was also a young kid that killed people, so.
Yeah, and I will say this, who everyone above them underestimated.
Yeah. Which he did too with the Runs.
Yeah, he did. He just thought the Runs were just little punks. Except he forgot that at one point everyone thought he was just a little punk.
Yeah. And look how that quickly that changed. Yeah, this film is like I mean, but it's something that we see in like other shows and movies too, right? That deal with this world, but it's it was done well in this film too. I'll say that.
Yeah, I thought it was good. I'm trying to think if there's anything that I didn't like. I mean, there were just a couple scenes I thought that it didn't really add much to the film, but it's not like it was just so out of place, if that makes sense. So yeah, I don't really have anything specifically to criticize with the movie.
Yeah, there was just like some scenes that I'm what I'm taking out of them is like a cultural not critique, but a cultural
difference.
Not difference, but like when you're trying to like explain like a different society and culture through film, cinema. I forgot what the term is for, but it's like basically using scenes to just show us like a different aspect of like compared to our American viewpoints, but like that's just me extrapolating, because otherwise, to your point, if I'm looking at face value, there's many scenes that don't really like I don't remember, like because I'm thinking about the movie now, I'm remembering them, but like honestly I don't remember them, so that's to your point about like they're extra, they're superfluous. Like I agree.
Yeah, no, I don't know if there's anything else you wanted to touch upon. I think we pretty much hit most of the key points.
Yeah, I guess like I want to get to final thoughts. So one thing I'll say as we wrap up this discussion is like one thing I liked about this film and I got out of it is that I'm not an expert in Brazilian history, and this is still like a snapshot, but you do see that like it almost like on a different level, like a sadness, because you see that like there was a point where Brazil had there was a lot of optimism about what it could be, and that didn't materialize, but also how things are changing now in Brazil today, right? The demographic situation is different. The economy is different.
The demographic situation in Brazil is night and day compared to what it was in the 80s.
Yeah, and you see this now with their politicians now, that they're also they're striving and looking for an answer, but there's no quick and easy one. And like their elites and political class are as well corrupt as everybody else's, but like it's exacerbated with the situations with COVID and everything. But yeah, I just want to say before you get to final thoughts, but I guess I'll go first on final thoughts if you want.
Sure.
Yeah, so this film, like I thought it was really well done. I thought like it did a lot of things that I always look in movies where they show you, they don't tell you. I keep saying that in this pod, but like I always hate it when there's films that just give you like the characters are talking, to like their dialogue is basically explaining what's happening. You're like, okay, this is just a cheap trick. Or you have a narrator that like explains like entire sentences for you. And yeah, I think it piques your interest enough to dig deeper into Brazil if you want, which is also a good aspect to this film, to this movie. I think yes, there's some extra scenes where you're like you can probably have taken them out, but you can also argue that maybe for cultural relevancy they're in there. But that's just like that's everybody's gonna have a different take on that. And I do think like this film, you know, it's showing you it almost came out in the right time, because what you see now with hindsight is when this came out in 2002, you could argue that's actually the turning point between the Brazil of like the last 40 years and what the Brazil probably the next 40 will look like. Like it's like a turning point, like era where like now we see where Brazil's going, and it doesn't look great, honestly.
No.
And what Brazil, like, I wonder if you're born in like the 50s, you're going to be an old man in like 2030. Like what it must feel like to see the
change.
I guess when you're that old, you've seen a lot of change and transformation, and it'd be interesting to hear from that generation eventually.
Well, yeah, I mean, well, we see some parallels, right? We were even talking about this fairly recently because both parts of our families are from Mexico, right? And so you see the way even they look at a movie like Roma, which is a Netflix film, and it's just a different era, and the era between then and the Mexico of today is just not kind of night and day, right? And so it's, I think to your point, it's like, yeah, like you're going to see a lot of changes, especially like even in Brazil, like it's going to become something that like the older generation can't even recognize.
Yeah, but and to add on to your Roma point, is like how my grandma and uncle, who are like, who are older than my mom, viewed it, was definitely different than how my mom viewed that film, and definitely different than I viewed that film. Right,
sure.
right there, like to your point, it shows you the difference in just generations. Your entire viewing experience could be completely different, which is intriguing too. But yeah, sorry, let you jump in before then. My score was 9 out of 10, so just wanted to say that.
All right. Out of curiosity, how come it wasn't higher?
Since
you said there was nothing you had that you picked out that you disliked.
I think it wasn't higher because for me to reach a 10 out of 10, I have to feel something emotionally that I don't usually feel. It's a bias I have. And I watched this movie thinking that it was really great and stuff, but then I ended up finishing it and going like, it's a great film, but is it a masterpiece? And I had a hard time giving that score.
I'm curious if we were a little bit older, right, and we viewed this at 2002, right, before you'd seen all of these other films, if you would have ranked it higher, just based on probably how kind of groundbreaking it was during that time in terms of some of the film techniques.
Maybe it would have been a 9.5, but I hold 10s like hard. So.
All right, that was just my curiosity, my curiousness. Yeah, I mean,
I'm a hard grader, Alexis.
Yeah, apparently, dude.
No curve.
That's fair. What I will say about this film, it was important because it gives you some historical context into Brazil, which is not always at least talked about here in the U.S. Right, and I think because a lot of people within the last 2 decades had seen Brazil just based on reports that you read, not really knowing what goes on there a whole lot. You'd see, they're like on the list of rising economies that they're going to take over, right, but you don't really see some of the like intricacies or some of the things that are really fundamentally just like messed up within Brazilian society. Is specifically a lot of the inequality there, and I think that's what you sort of rehashed to your point of bringing up the reaction differences within the media outlet or the people who worked at the media, right? Because they had no idea what Rocket was talking about. So it shows that sort of cultural difference as well as a socioeconomic one. The other thing that I will say that we didn't really talk about, you were saying that, yeah, it's interesting seeing like Brazil, how it was coming up and how it was viewed as having a whole lot of potential. And I think you see a lot of frustration in the decades since this film came out, whereas where it really culminated in the election of Bolsonaro, right? Which is a very reactionary president, and he's very sort of polarizing. He has a lot of people who love him, a lot of people who don't. And to your point, we've discussed it before, it's going to be a very interesting election where it looks like Lula is going to be a lot of run, and it's going to be a race between Lula and Bolsonaro.
Who are you supporting?
I will not, honestly, neither. I think both have major issues.
If I go to Brazil next year, I'll try to get you a Lula shirt just for you, dude.
Please do not. I don't want a Bolsonaro shirt either. I am not a supporter of either candidate. I think both.
Yeah, but I know how much you love Lula, so I'll definitely find one for you, dude.
I just said that both have major issues. But okay. Putting it lightly, bro. Putting it lightly. But anyway, so aside from, I just had to get in some of that little historical, I guess, context. I like the authenticity of the film. I thought the musical score was fantastic. Thought the movie had a really good pace. Trying to think if there was anything I didn't like. There was just a couple scenes where I'm like, was that really like necessary to include it? But it could have been that it might have struck a chord differently with Brazilian audiences than it would international ones, right? Because there might have been some just cultural context that I'm just not aware of. But yeah, there wasn't anything that I could necessarily pick out. I thought the acting was great. I really dislike Lil Z, so that goes to show he did a really good job. I'm trying to think. I thought Rocket was okay. I can't say he was sort of a standout performance to me. But I did like Benny. I thought he did a really good job sort of conveying, his character's sort of shift in wants and desires. Yeah, that's pretty much the only sort of, I guess, nitpickiness that I had. I didn't really see a whole lot of point for Angelica's character. I think they could have wrote her off and probably just, in a different way, showed Benny's shift in priorities without having to include her. Just kind of like a throwaway character in a way to me. And yeah, I guess that's pretty much about it. I would recommend this film, but yeah, I also gave it a 9 out of 10. More because I thought a couple of the scenes were kind of like throwaway.
Yeah, I mean that's fair. Yeah, I mean there's like, I was kind of reaching with like some of the scenes, but if like I took it at face value, I would be like, I don't know what. Like, did we need this? I'm assuming that you're trying to say something about machismo because, like, there's no other explanation for me. I'm like,
yeah, and so there could be, right? I mean, we're not Brazilian. We don't have family that's Brazilian. I just know some of Brazilian culture based on football, as well as some of the music that I listen to at times. But that's about it. And it's more. I'm trying to think. I don't know of any specifically like I guess classical Brazilian artists that I listen to. It's more just a couple DJs that I've come across.
I think that's the hard part with like these kind of films, just like when we done like the Taiwanese one, like we can extrapolate based on what the movie's telling us, but like if you grew up in that culture, you're definitely gonna have more.
Oh, it's gonna, just like I'm sure to American audiences, Roma is not gonna strike a chord, but to us, you'd be like, oh yeah, of course. There's like some scenes that really hit home because you grew up with it.
I feel like Roma wasn't for me though. Roma was for
right. It's for that older generation, but even you could pick up a lot more within that movie than other audiences would.
For me, the movie that represents Mexico.
Amores Perros.
Yes, that's the Mexico I know.
I remember you like watching it. You're like, man, and that's another movie I think we both recommend.
Yeah, that's a movie that was just like everybody says everybody has their movie that represents Mexico. It's like that
represents an aspect of Mexico. I don't know all of it.
Well, what I mean, like, so when I say, I guess I'm using a heavy word. I meant more like, not like every part of Mexico. I meant like that era. That film
in the 2000s?
It represents that era. Just like if you ever get to Roma, you'll see that film represents a certain era of Mexico. Yeah.
You know what's fascinating? I just realized that movie came out in 2000, and that was the point in time when Vicente Fox got elected.
Yeah.
So I kind of signaled a little change. Yeah, it's interesting. I didn't put two and two together.
Yeah, so that's what I mean by like represents. I don't mean like represents every aspect of it because Mexico's a diverse country. I meant like that era, like that film does to me represent like the era that like I kind of remember because there was a lot of optimism. Okay, we're going off tangent, but there was a lot of optimism with that guy at one point. And
you said the Fox?
Yeah, and
well, yeah, but you have to know the historical context. It's because he was the first politician elected to be president of Mexico after that wasn't PRI, and the PRI had ruled for, I believe, 70 years before that.
I thought it was 80. I thought it was 80.
I think it had been since the mid.
Was it like
early to mid 30s though?
Is it like 76 years? It was something like. Hold on, let me look it up real quick. All right, this is the last thing we'll talk about on the pod.
Yeah. Hold on. 1929 to 71 years.
71 years. Okay. Yeah, I knew it was like, I knew it wasn't 70,
It's a
but yeah, it was a long
long
time.
time.
It was a long time. Yeah. But anyways, we'll leave it at that. But
Yeah, anyway, if you enjoyed our commentary on City of God, please like and subscribe to our channel and give us any recommendations for future films that you may want us to review. But anyway, stay tuned for next week's episode, and we're out.